We can get into quite a good yoga pose down here. Oh, stretching the back. Hello, welcome to my new video. My name is Lou and I make videos about how to de-distort your reality so that you can be in exceptional mental health and how you can optimize your life experience. Today I want to talk about what happens when everyone expects you to be successful. This is sort of a story time, but also sort of a lesson. Now, when I was a child, my brother and we had working class parents who were doing side hustles before that was even in the dictionary. We were born in the late 80s. My parents worked every hour God gave them to send us to private schools. He went to the boys' version of this school and I went to the girls' version of this school. Now, my brother was considered to be, not just in my family, but by the school, some type of child prodigy. He was the Victor Ludorum, which just means like a bit of a show off. I'm kidding. It means like he won everything in like sports. He was also tested for gifted and talented for like maths and English and reading. He was just this massively precocious child who was above average on most domains. Me, by contrast, I didn't realize that primary school was even supposed to be educational. I went to this amazing school, as I said. The boys' school was a bit more academic than the girls' school. They were taught like Latin and this kind of stuff, and at the girls' school it was a lot softer. Like the skills we were being taught were softer skills, and like it was very much focused on sports and arts and drama and just like having a good time. I effectively didn't take an interest in academia, take an interest in books, in science, in maths, in anything at all until I was about 13 years old. For me, the academic drive that came to characterize my life forevermore basically came on like a secondary sexual characteristic. It was almost like a cognitive puberty for me to even be interested in anything like reading, anything that would tax my brain. Meanwhile, my brother from the age of like 2 was reading really advanced books, was incredibly good at maths. He got full marks on his like grammar school entrance exams. He was the one on whom the spotlight shone. I didn't envy him one bit for that, to be quite frank. I realized much later though that when you have that much pressure on you and when everybody is telling you you will be the successful one, I didn't realize as his younger sister at the time that was such a terrible burden actually for him. And effectively being in his shadow, having no light shone my way, having no expectations of me, my parents basically enabled me to sneak up from behind academically and intellectually. So I had this history of being kind of overshadowed. I don't think it was deliberate. I think because my parents were very resource stretched, I think they honestly just had to back the most profitable horse, almost like having a star product. And I think because my parents saw my brother and I as a sort of social mobility experiment, and he was the thing that was yielding results way earlier than I was. I don't even think my parents thought I had a brain until I was maybe 22 or something. My parents' focus was squarely on my brother. He was the one who was getting the extra push, if you will. I was sort of just left to flower in my own time. Because my brother was so precocious, I just looked way below par compared to him. Because my parents worked all the time, we would always be dropped off at school at like 6 in the morning. We would be in supper clubs after school. Like my parents worked all the time and we didn't get read to as children. I certainly didn't get read to. I don't think my brother was read to, like storybooks at bedtime. My parents were a police officer and a nurse, and they worked every hour God gave them. I basically learnt to read, and this is going to sound so bizarre. I wouldn't even say it was learning to read. The free time that my mum did have, she basically would cut up like words. So there would be little paper words, you know, the way you might sort of cut up a newspaper or something, and she would put them all in like like this boiled sweetie pot. The way she would teach me to read was basically by showing me these words from a pot. I was never given books. I was never given anything that would develop the skill of actually scanning a line of text and actually being able to read it aloud. When it actually came to reading aloud in class or even enjoying reading a children's book, I took no pleasure in it at all, because the way I had understood to enjoy language was simply to enjoy words as these singular, discrete objects for understanding, comprehension, obviously spelling. And it was a really bizarre thing, because I was basically not thought to be particularly bright, I suppose, you know, in primary school or secondary school, we'll get to in a bit. I had absolutely perfect spelling. I could absolutely wash the floor with anybody when it came to vocabulary, and I thought learning the words from the pot was learning to read, and it was not. I didn't enjoy reading. When it would come to picking up a novel, I wouldn't enjoy it because I wasn't voluble kind of visually in actually scanning words across a line. When I actually did start to be purchased books, I wanted poetry books. They would sort of send me into a library and say, you know, what would you like? And it was very rare that we would even go to a bookshop, like look inside the books and see which had the least words. And it was poetry. So the first thing that I ever really learnt to do or learnt to enjoy was poetry. I didn't like children's stories. I didn't like being read stories. I didn't like reading stories. I liked poetry. And this is where I started to realize that actually maybe I wasn't thick the way that my parents kind of thought I was, just by contrast with my brother. And I also started to write poetry at this point. So I started reading poetry, I started writing poetry, and this is where the things in my life start to break from this expectation that I'm going to be a fool forever. At secondary school, I'm obviously still in my brother's shadow. He's only 18 months older than me, so 2 years ahead in the school system. We went to the same grammar school. It was for the first time in my entire life, as I said, this was like a sort of puberty for me, learning to take an interest in academia, in potentially going to university. Though neither of my parents had, we would be first gen students if me and my brother went. It's just dawned on me, like a sort of pubescent epiphany, that I really needed to start taking academics seriously. Obviously, this had been drilled into me when I was revising for the 11 plus, this grammar school entrance exam. It just switched on something I didn't even know was in me. So I had in me what was in fact quite a seriously competitive academic drive. I was quite glad in some ways that the pressure was still all on my brother. I could see how much it was actually stressing him out to have been singled out as this child prodigy, Mensa-worthy, scholarship-winning boy. And although I didn't have the concepts at the time, that those expectations were actually ego-trapping my brother. An ego trap, which is defined by Doug Lisle, who's a social and evolutionary psychologist. It effectively means that when people have very high expectations of you and you have garnered status that has led to those high expectations, one way of actually preserving that status is by not trying, and to basically kick over the table and make it eminently apparent that one is in fact not trying anymore. So that if anything goes wrong, if you get a bad grade, if you flunk an exam, you basically don't suffer the loss of status, because people simply think, well, by God, you just weren't trying. You would have done so well. I saw this in not just my brother, but other kids who had kind of tiger parents or helicopter parents. I could see that there was a sort of child prodigy, gifted and talented pipeline to this ego trap, where actually having that spotlight shone on you so brightly from such a young age was actually just a terrible mistake on the part of the parents. The pressure, the stress, the anxiety, the stakes, it's just too much to shoulder when you're a developing person. And obviously you have way more than just academic interests. You have social interests, eventually sexual interests. One strategy that a lot of children will put into effect without even really realizing it is this kind of self-sabotage, where if you appear to stop trying, even appear to yourself to not be trying, you can actually preserve in your mind's eye and in the minds of others that yes, you are that bright young thing, but you're not trying. So the fruits aren't coming, the fruits aren't being born. Because this was all going on with my brother, it really allowed me to sort of plant myself, to sort of bury myself in and sort of bed in as this little slightly overlooked seedling and make a really concerted effort to blossom. I kept this all very much up my sleeve. I would never show people how hard I was working. I would keep any such rehearsals completely private. I would even, if we were doing a book in, English or whatever, I would read the book several times at home before we even took it into class, and I would read it aloud and I would learn all the words I didn't know, and I basically was a constant rehearser in private, in silence, just in my lane, and nobody knew about it. What this allowed me to do was to basically just emerge in class and in my exams and even to my own parents with this completely unprecedented, unforeseen amount of ability, and it really caught people's attention. Suddenly I went from being this completely, for better or worse, overlooked child to absolutely coming from behind and finally realizing that I did have the chops to make something of myself intellectually. This is where things get a little more complicated. Obviously, things don't go quite to plan. Obviously had an eating disorder, which meant I dropped out of high school. But when I eventually went to university, in my undergraduate degree, I went to King's College London, and I put into effect the same strategy there. I stayed in my lane, I moved in silence, and I eventually came first in my entire year. It was once again me doing incredible amounts of work behind the scenes without anybody really paying a huge amount of attention, but then producing these striking performances in my exams and in my essays. Even outside of university proper, I was publishing papers. After that, I went to Oxford for my master's, and then I went to Cambridge for my PhD. It was at this point I started to realize that I was this sort of good news bringer in my family system. So it had moved away from being my brother, and now the focus kind of unfortunately was now on me, and there was this pressure I felt. In any case, I felt rather disconnected from my parents, and I felt, with the eating disorder that had meant I left high school early, I felt I had so much to prove when I finally got to university, and I had absolutely bossed my undergrad, 16 firsts, straight firsts in my finals. I was nominated for some medal or something, and then I got a distinction at Oxford, and then I got $250,000 of scholarships for my PhD, and I got places at Oxford and Cambridge, and I basically became just this kind of like an academic weapon. And even though a lot of my efforts had been rather clandestine, there was really no hiding this anymore. There was nowhere to hide. It was apparent that I was becoming something. I had completely shown that I wasn't thick, I wasn't daft, the child that could barely read a line, could barely scan a line of prose, was now writing papers, delivering papers, getting into these amazing universities. And suddenly the pressure that I think my brother had felt was now squarely on my head. It wasn't so much that I ever really self-sabotaged, nor was it that I ever suffered a sort of downfall, but I think the problem is that there was this constant fear that the credit I had built with my parents and this connection to them that was so performance-based could be so easily lost if I was no longer the sort of new prodigy in my family, there was just this constant pressure to be the bearer of good news, whether it was getting into a certain conference or getting another scholarship or getting a paper published or anything. I mean, it could have been any of these meritorious acts. I just felt like I constantly had to be the source of good news. I felt like everybody now expects me to succeed. There's no flexibility anymore. There's no moving in the shadows anymore. I am the one with the spotlight on me now. I think in some ways this can definitely constrain the types of things that you will sort of stick your neck out and do, but more specifically it constrains being open with people about what you're trying to achieve. In fairness, I would say to a lot of people that want to achieve something big or something that's at least incredibly meaningful to you, is that you should move in silence. Enjoy the fact that the spotlight might be on louder, more visible people. You should take that and actually enjoy being able to breathe deeply and calmly while achieving what it is that you want, and without others ego trapping you by having these huge expectations that you're just inevitably successful. Now that my educational life is behind me, although I would definitely go back and do another undergrad if I could, I probably will at some point, I think these sorts of things can still permeate and push into adult life. When people sort of put you in a box, you might think you want to be in that box, especially when you're not yet in it. And I think there's a lot of people that absolutely hanker for the spotlight, whether that's in their own homes, within their own family units, or whether it's, you know, on social media amongst people you've never met, never will, and probably wouldn't like if you did meet them. I think it's very important to remain very much in your lane and really enjoy being able to rehearse in silence and rehearse in the shadows for as long as you possibly can. If it then means you get to spring your golden nuggets of achievement on people almost out of nowhere or apparently out of nowhere, the more that we try to enlarge and magnify and spotlight our journeys and our processes, the worse for us in actually achieving our goals. That's just my little story of kind of being the family underdog and how it all basically got reframed after my brother was very severely ego trapped by parental pressure and expectation.